Yesterday I played what I think was a stunning example of smiley-faced fascism. You remember Jonah Goldberg's book, Liberal Fascism, and that had that smiley yellow face on it with a Hitler mustache. This was Tim Cook talking about Apple and how it was going to ban what he called hate speech from his platforms, which include the App Store and iTunes, so all the podcast venues, and that it was a sin not to, because the inner voice of conscience was sacred, and his inner voice of conscience was going to guide him to know what speech was hate speech. And I pointed out that my inner voice of conscience tells me that the right thing to do is let everybody speak, as freedom of speech is more important than my personal way of looking at things, because only when you let everybody speak do you move beyond your own prejudices and get the broader view that is 1,000 voices arguing the point, so you can hear which of them is making the best argument. That is what my inner voice says. And I was thinking about this. I talked about this a little on the show. I was thinking, why is it the left used to understand? The left used to understand that corporations are power centers and therefore prone to abuse their power. The left used to be all about this. Not so long ago, remember when the Occupy movement was dumping litter all over the streets of America, they were sitting there going, the evil corporations. We used to laugh at them because they were on their iPhones, using Google to send text messages. All these things that they were using came from corporations. And of course, corporations are wonderful. It's nothing inherently wrong with corporations. There's something inherently wrong with great concentrations of power, something inherently corrupting with great concentrations of power. As Lord Acton, the great historian of freedom, said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I was thinking, why did the left forget this? Now, of course, the answer occurred to me after the show, and that's why I wanted to come back to it, that we shifted from a manufacturing economy to an information economy. And the old days, corporations used to be more right-wing. Why? Because a manufacturing economy is about objects and selling objects, and right-wing conservative principles apply, right? You can make a car and you can sell it on TV by draping a half-naked woman across it, and I hope you do. But once I buy the car, if it breaks down, I'm going to dump the half-naked woman by the side of the road and go trade in the car and get a better one. I'm going to buy it from somebody else. So one of the reasons that Detroit fell apart and the American car industry fell apart was because it was so wealthy it thought it could just give everything to the unions, and the unions thought they could just take everything, and ultimately the conservative principles destroyed that manufacturing center. And manufacturing, anytime you make a product, it's got to be a good product. You got to hold to basic conservative principles. Competition is important. Competition makes your product better. All these things that we talk about in capitalism, all of them help you when you're a manufacturer. Information is inherently an emotional industry. You can say, well, information is all about numbers and all about fact, but which information do you turn to first? Do you turn to the thing with all the 17% of this and 87% of that? Or do you turn to somebody, destroying the left and the outrageous thing that somebody on the left said? Information is all about emotionalism, and so is leftism. Leftism is about getting people to panic so that they surrender power to you. Now, it's important to remember, as right-wingers, it's important to remember here, the problem is the concentration of power. It's not the philosophy. The concentration of power affects all people the same. This is the thing. People are not good or bad. In every movement, there are good and bad people. In every movement, there are people whose intentions are good. And in every movement, there are people who are good. I mean, obviously, there are movements that are so inherently evil that no good person would join them. But in most movements, there are people who are decent. But power, all of those people are going to go over a range of morality, and all of them are corruptible by power. And so that is why our founders said, we are going to put the power centers off each other. And that is why these things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, which are monopolies, essentially, monopolies of information, are getting out of control and are starting to abuse their power. These are big corporations silencing people, individual people, deeming their opinions hateful. That's just a decree, right? That's not an actual description of anything. That is just a decree from a very powerful person, Tim Cook, in his, fantastic corporation of Apple. It's just him decreeing that those voices of individuals will be crushed by his corporation, will be silenced by his corporation. And I think that we should definitely look at the way these things are governed. If they're governed as platforms, they should have to let everybody speak because they can't be sued. They're getting a benefit from this. It's amazing. One of the things that makes me a conservative as opposed to a leftist is that I think conservatives are much more uncomfortable with power. And I think that leftism basically includes power as one of its goods, assuming all the time that the revolution is going to come and they're going to win. And so that's why you get this kind of weird stuff where people say, only the government should control guns. And you say, you want Donald Trump to control guns? Well, no, that's terrible. You know, they forget that they sometimes are going to lose and they can't always cheat their way back, you know. But what the WASPs knew is this thing that was written into our Constitution and described in the Federalist Papers by James Madison. This famous quote, I think it's 51, Federalist 51. James Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And that's the problem that we're facing today. We're facing the loss of this understanding that power centers need to be opposed to other power centers. And so when Tim Cook gets up there and says, Apple is going to, in my inner light, my inner conscience, going to decide who gets to speak and who's hateful, he is forgetting that he is just on top of a very, very powerful corporation. His inner light is no better than anybody else's inner light. I take that back. It may be better than some people's. It may be worse than others, but it is not dispositive. It is not the thing that should be deciding who gets to speak in America. And that's one of the ways you know you've gone wrong, is when you start to silence people. Anyway, that, you know, I just want to point out how much of what we're talking about is not really about left and right. It is about the fact that the left has a kind of power now it didn't necessarily have before, a cultural power, an informational power, and a corporate power. And that is, if it is going more and more wrong, if it is becoming more and more radical, if it's becoming more and more censorious and more controlling, it may not be completely part of their philosophy. It may simply be that too much power has collected in their hands and needs to be broken up. Some of these organizations need to be regulated and they need to be broken up.